Bollywood versus South Korean cinema, which is better? It can get quite subjective. In some ways, cinema is like a cuisine. Some days you might prefer kimchi, other days you'd want butter chicken or a hamburger and pizza. But comparisons have to be drawn, and there has to be one winner. At the end of this video, there will be a winner, so stay tuned. The comparison will have 4 categories. Each category will have a weighting, and I will score Bollywood and South Korea against each category. Now, the scoring is mine. If you guys feel that I have been biased or unfair, please leave your comments behind and we can have a healthy discussion. The first category is local impact, the significance of South Korean cinema within Korea and Bollywood within India. This has a weighting of 20%. The second category will look at both Bollywood and South Korea from a global significance perspective. That has a weighting of 30%. We will follow it up with the most important category, quality. This gets a weighting of 30%. And finally, the fourth category will be about the popularity of actors and actresses from Bollywood and South Korea, with a weighting of 20%. At the end of it all, we will tally up the scores and come up with one winner, so stay tuned. The population of South Korea is 51 million. Reasonably sized blockbuster gets 12 million plus admissions. Now that has a staggering turnout ratio of 24%. That's almost a quarter of the population going out to theaters and watching their big films. Staggering. Bollywood comes nowhere near. India has a population of 1.38 billion people, and the turnout can be, for a blockbuster, 30 million plus footfalls, a ratio of only 2% of the population turning up. Even if we look at purely the Hindi belt, the Hindi-speaking belt, which has a population of approximately 530 million, the turnout ratio will be about 6%. Now, the comparison is not like for like. You've got to factor in things like regional cinema. There is no alternative cinema in Korea. The competition comes from K-drama, but that doesn't release in theaters. Whereas in Bollywood, there's strong competition from, Telugu, Tamil, Punjabi films. The regional cinemas are huge as well. Not to mention the demographics. Korea obviously is a developed nation with higher GDP per capita, whereas India, there's a lot of population that just cannot afford to go and watch films in theaters. But we cannot do much about the fact of disparity in incomes and the fact that India is still a developing country. But in saying that, the huge population, you would still expect a better turnout. There is a lot of population that is rich and urbanized. So for such low footfalls, we can't really say that everyone in India follows cinema as religiously as the Koreans do. And for that, I would give a score of 10 out of 20 to Bollywood, and a score of 16 out of 20 for South Korean cinema.
야, 우리 지금처럼 편한 오빠 동생 사이로 지내자.
Now, in terms of global reach and impact, both Bollywood and South Korean cinema are hugely popular. Outside of Hollywood, these are the two biggest movie industries out there in the world. So massive reach. It's difficult to score this category, but I will have to choose a winner, and it will be Bollywood. The reason for Bollywood coming out on top is primarily because the films are released theatrically in more countries with more number of shows, which gives the viewers an opportunity to watch these films. The South Korean films barely make it, a theatrical release is very rare. Only films like Parasite and Train to Busan had a good theatrical release outside of Korea. But other than that, there are hardly any big films that are coming out. For Bollywood, in a country like New Zealand, the films are in the top 10. There is multiple shows running 2 or 3 weeks after the film is released, so that's good to see. And this story is very similar in other countries as well, the US or the UK. I mean, obviously, the number of Indians present in these countries far outweighs the Korean people. But you'd think that with South Korean cinema having decent branding and global significance, there would be more theatrical releases. We just don't see them. So on this basis, I would like to score Bollywood 25 out of 30. And for Korea, just because of this limited theatrical release for most of its films, it would get a 20 out of 30. Quality. Now, this is very subjective and often the hardest to assess. There are a couple of ways to do it. You could look at IMDb ratings, although for Bollywood films there's a lot of vote brigading that happens, and personally I'm not a fan of IMDb when it comes to analyzing Bollywood films. The reason I say that is some of the biggest grossing films where people have paid money to watch for have been very poorly rated, whereas films that have been watched by a handful number of people have really high ratings, so can't really draw great comparisons there. But what we can look at is recognition and recall value. The Korean films obviously have an upper hand here. The number of films that have global acceptance are huge. You have Oldboy that came out in 2003, often called the best film of that decade. You had Parasite that came out in 2019, often called the best film of that decade. And in between you have a host of films that have global recognition and acclaim. Films like Brotherhood of War, I think the local name was Taiguchi. You have The Man from Nowhere. You have films like Ode to My Father, The Handmaiden, Memories of a Murder, A Taxi Driver, Train to Busan. There's so many of them that just have a really strong international branding. As far as Bollywood is concerned, you don't really recall that many global films. You can't count Slumdog to Millionaire and Life of Pi as Bollywood. Those are Hollywood films. So ignoring those, BK, My Name is Khan, Three Idiots, these come to mind. But then again, they don't have that level of universal appeal compared to a Parasite or Train to Busan. So as far as recognition is concerned, South Korea is ahead. Another aspect to look at is remakes. Now, you will rarely ever hear a Bollywood film being remade in a Korean film or in a Hollywood film. Just doesn't happen. But on the other side, Bollywood is notorious for remaking films from South Korea, Hollywood, and regional cinema. In fact, not so much Hollywood lately, but Korean films are favorites, as well as Tamil and Telugu films. Recently we had Bharat, which is a copy of Ode to My Father. You also have Radhe, which is set to be the official remake of The Outlaws. I mean, the list is growing and will continue to grow. You know, when you're copying films from other regions at that scale, it goes to show that the storytelling department in your own region is weak. And just purely from a remake perspective, Bollywood is very behind. The third point I want to make about quality is looking at the average film. Now, I haven't watched too many average Korean films. Most of the films that I watch are well polished and well liked, so I am going to be biased here. But if you watch an average Bollywood film, you may never return to Bollywood again. Some of the content is so poor, it's not even funny. And by poor content, I don't mean the script, it's just the acting, the maturity of the editing, cinematography, and just complete illogical films that are often churned out by Bollywood. The number is huge. Now, one may argue why these films are made in the first place. There is a market for them, and then you think, why is there a market for them? Well, maybe the audience maturity is not as high as, say, the Korean audience or audience of any other nation, because if these films were continuously going to flop, then obviously they wouldn't be made in the first place. But again, you know, Bollywood really needs to up the ante in terms of the total number of films that are releasing and the quality of those films. Yes, the top bracket, the films are well polished, well made, but that cannot be said for 90% of the films that are made. So looking at these factors, all these three factors, the Korean film industry will get a high score from me. It's going to be a 25 out of 30 in terms of the quality department. For Bollywood, there needs to be significant improvement, and when they stop remaking so many films, when more of their films get better global recognition, the score can go up. But for now, it's a 15 out of 30. Now, in terms of popularity, it's a one-sided contest. Unfortunately, the population obviously sides with the Indians. I'm going to look at Instagram as the platform, and you can see the list here: Akshay Kumar, Salman Khan, Priyanka Chopra, Deepika Padukone, huge numbers on Instagram. Whereas if I look at the Koreans, and pardon me for the pronunciation, don't want to make a fool of myself, but I will attempt it. Lee Min-ho, you know, the big guy, 22 million followers. Park Seo-joon, 16 million. Lee Jung-suk at 17 million, just nowhere near the Bollywood celebrities, even the female actresses, Lee Ji-yoon, the most famous Korean on Instagram, 16 million. You have Bae Suzy, 14 million. And look, if I've skipped any name, do let me know, but I think I have covered most of these names. One thing I do want to call out as well is that the Bollywood celebrities are well versed with English. That gives them an extra edge. The Koreans are mostly quite local, and even though BTS has made it global, there is just no other name that has that global presence at the moment. So for this category, I'm going to give Bollywood 16 out of 20, and for the Koreans, it's going to be 10 out of 20. Let's look at the results, and we have a winner, a very close winner here. South Korean cinema edging out Bollywood 71 to 66. In the end, the scoring on quality obviously played a crucial role. Although I would like to end this video on a note that Bollywood and the future of Bollywood looks a lot more promising. The money being thrown, the popularity of the actors and actresses, and the potential for growth. If you only have a penetration of 2 or 3%, imagine if you start making really good quality films, how much money can be made and what sort of viewership levels you can attain in India. And as the population advances, as the country is uplifted and the benefits of a rising economy are realized across all spectrums of society, India is going to come out on top. Whereas I think Korean cinema is quite limited, at least in its local region. How much can 50 million grow? On the other hand, if they keep making films like Parasite and Old Boy, you just never know. The vision that these directors and scriptwriters have is tremendous. One other thing I want to talk about Korean films is that both Old Boy and Parasite are not in the top 10 highest grossing films of all time for South Korea. So you can see that yes, the developed world lapped onto these films for their unique stories, but there are so many other hidden gems in South Korean cinema that you can watch and cherish. And then you can really see the difference between the two cinemas at its present. If you like this video, please do consider subscribing. There's plenty of useful content on Bollywood, and I'll see you in the next one.